Okay, it's 10:02 a.m. here in Denver, Colorado. Thank you again for joining us this morning. We're pleased that you're here for the release of the 2023 Colorado Latino Policy Agenda. Our webinar today includes a presentation of key findings, and we've set aside time at the end for questions using the Q&A feature in the Zoom. It's also being recorded, and copies will be made available upon request afterwards. If you haven't yet received a copy of our 2023 report, press release, and polling top lines, enter your email address in the chat so that we can get them to you after the presentation. Also, all of this information is available online at coloradolатinopolicyagenda.org. With that housekeeping out of the way, I'm going to turn it over now to our panelists, starting with Alex Sanchez.
Thank you, Curtis. Good morning, everyone. I'm Alex Sanchez. I'm the president and CEO of Voces Unidas. Thank you for joining us this morning for our briefing on the 2023 Colorado Latino Policy Agenda. This is the third annual policy agenda based on polling commissioned by Voces Unidas and Colorado Organization for Latina Opportunity and Reproductive Rights, COLOR, represented here today by President and CEO Dusty Gurule. From the start, the goal of the policy agenda has been to provide insights for elected officials, community leaders, media, and other interested parties into the views of Latinas and Latinos on pressing policy, political, and social issues here in Colorado. In our third year, we continue to uncover newsworthy and noteworthy information. Here to walk us through the highlights is Dr. Gabriel Sanchez, whose team at BSP Research conducted the poll and provided analysis for the third straight year. Dr. Sanchez.
Thank you very much, Alex, Dusty, and all of your teams for entrusting us at BSP Research with the data collection and analysis. It's amazing to see this 3 years in. I will say I've been polling for several years, better part of 15, and I've never seen another state have a dedicated multi-year study this robust anywhere else in the nation. So what you folks are doing here in Colorado is truly innovative. You see the specifications of the poll design. This had an overall sample size of 1,600 randomly drawn Latino registered voters. The key in the survey was to make sure that this was representative across the Latino population of the full state. So we balanced the data to the census's demographic profile. And at the end of the day, you see, although this is a nonpartisan poll and we did not weight the data extensively on partisanship, when we balance the demographics, you see that across the past 3 years, we've ensured that we have representative partisan affiliation of the respondents. So for those of you that are interested in knowing, does this match what Latinos look like in terms of their partisanship, you can see across all 3 years, it's been stable and is representative of the population across both demographics and party affiliation. As noted, my team at BSP Research has been the research partner on this project. We have more than 20 years of experience polling on Latino issues. Myself and Dr. Matt Barreto, who's a co-founder of BSP Research, not only have PhDs with specialization in Latino politics and survey methods, but we've polled extensively Latinos in the state of Colorado. You see the field dates of July 1 through July 27th. And at the end of the day, one of the key goals of this survey was ensuring that, like a lot of surveys done of Latinos in Colorado, we did not just have a Denver metro area robust sample and not really anybody outside of that metro area. In fact, we oversampled in rural areas of the state to make sure that we could break out differences and nuances across the population based on regional dynamics as well as congressional districts. So you see whether we're talking about Northeast, Southeast, or the Western Slope, we have the ability to talk about any potential nuances based on respondents' area of region in the state. And you see across congressional districts, we have well over 100, and most of the congressional districts just missed that in a few, but close enough to make some overall insights. One of the things that we wanted to do in this poll is obviously look at the policy priorities of the Latino electorate across the state of Colorado. And we do this in two ways, both cueing respondents to think about federal priorities, which you see in front of you now, and then I'll show you state priorities in a second. Just like we found in 2022, economic concerns are the highest priority for Latinos. You see whether it's addressing the cost of living or inflation, the highest at 38%, improving wages and income at 32%, And as well, if you think about lowering the health of healthcare costs, another economic notion, you see that overall economic concerns are the biggest priority, but we also see gun violence and healthcare costs following up into that top 5. And I want to draw your attention to protecting women's reproductive health and abortion rights at 18%. It was not long ago that you would not see abortion and reproductive health anywhere near the top 10 of issues. As of 2022 and beyond, it's moved into that top priority list for Latinos in Colorado, just like it is nationally. And we also see, although immigration rights and immigration overall has no longer been the top 5 issue that it once was in 2016, 2018 into 2020, it still remains a top 10 issue, and specifically protecting immigrants' rights at 13% still is a priority, particularly for our immigrant community. When we think about queuing respondents, about state level priorities, you do see a lot of correlation, very similar story to what we thought in terms of the national level priorities. Economic concerns remain a top priority. You see addressing the rising cost of living and inflation, still number 1. That gives you a strong indication that for Latinos, regardless of whether they're thinking about federal or state level policy priorities, the economic stress that unfortunately a lot of our community is still facing is driving those issues to the forefront. The one issue that jumps out as a key priority at the state level and not federal is homelessness. So I think it's indicative of the fact that the Latino electorate in Colorado is a sophisticated voting population that understands differences in jurisdiction, notes that they perceive state and local elected officials should be paying more attention to homelessness as it faces their community. But again, you see a lot of correlation. Protecting women's and reproductive health and abortion rights, whether it's federal or state level, is still among the top 10. And addressing gun violence and mass shootings for both federal and state level priorities is again indicative of the fact that Latinos are unfortunately more likely to be victims of gun violence and have experience with mass shootings than any other population in the state. So that's reflective of the fact that they prioritize that policy issue. We wanted to provide some context in this survey for why economic policy items were at the top priority list. And you see, unfortunately, that's driven by the underlying context of a lot of financial hardship still facing large segments of the Latino population across the state. You see, whether we ask folks, in your specific situation, how are you doing? Do you feel comfortable and afford where you live currently in the state? And you see only 23% of overall respondents across the state are in that situation where they definitely feel comfortable to be able to afford where they live. On the flip side of that, 1/3 of Latinos can barely afford where they live right now or cannot afford period where they live. So you see the economic strain that unfortunately too many of our families are facing across the state of Colorado. We also asked folks over the past 12 months over the past year, has your financial situation gotten better or essentially worse? And you see that 1/3 of Latinos' financial situation grew more dire in 2023, while another 1/3 had not changed over the past year whatsoever. So keep in mind, 2022 was a very difficult financial situation for Latinos in Colorado. So the fact that 1/3 are seeing it even getting worse for them in 2023, I think is a very powerful number. We will say, however, and the value of having annual surveys is we can look at trends over time. It is a little bit better of a financial picture for Latinos across the state of Colorado, which I think is a positive trend. But unfortunately, we still have to emphasize for 1/3 of our population across the state, they're still facing financial hardships. They still need support to get through difficult financial times. When we think about the overall financial strain on Latino families across the state of Colorado, one thing that jumps out of the survey is unfortunately a large segment of the population are really feeling a housing crunch and not being able to afford their housing, whether it's rent or mortgages. So consequently, when we ask folks, do you support a range of public policy issues intended to address protection for renters or affordable housing, you see overwhelming support, whether it's the state taking action to make sure that cities and towns are building more affordable types of housing. You see over 80% of Latino registered voters support that initiative, or a range of protection for renters. I would think about the fact that you see over 75% support for requiring landlords to compensate tenants if the landlord breaks the leases, or creating legal protections to prevent unjust evictions of renters, et cetera. At the end of the day, we see essentially the foundation for what you might think of a renter's bill of rights, or a set of policies aimed at ensuring that they're not taken advantage of. This year's survey also had a lot of content specifically on the immigration policy attitudes of Latino registered voters across the state of Colorado. Again, although it's not a top 3 priority as it was in some years, it still is in the top 10 and a high priority for Latino voters. So we wanted to have a range of different public policy issues to put in front of respondents. You see there's high support for federal legislative actions, including a path to citizenship for DACA, as well as farm workers. Both of those communities have high support to ensuring that they have the support that they need to be able to flourish. But we also found that refugees and asylum seekers should be able to legally apply for entry into the U.S. And have their individual cases heard also at 76%. So again, strong support. I would say the overall findings in the survey as it relates to immigration policies is Latinos are highly supportive of common sense. And really, if you think about it, policies that support the overall livability of immigrants who people perceive are part of their community and deserve to be supported. Similarly, when we look at a number of other public policy issues in the context of immigration, nearly 8 out of 10 Latinos in Colorado want more federal support for long-term undocumented immigrant contributors that pay taxes and are part of our community. Slightly lower, 66% support for the federal government doing more to support newly arrived immigrants and refugees who have more recently arrived to the U.S. But in both cases, well over 50% support for ensuring that these newcomers to our community who pay their taxes, are law-abiding citizens, have the support that they needed and are welcomed into the community. We also see very high support for executive action if Congress won't act on immigration. I think, again, Latino voters in the state of Colorado are sophisticated. They understand the challenges of our political climate right now, with some semblance of Republicans in Congress not supporting President Biden's administration's actions or intended actions on immigration. So you see that Latinos are willing to give the president the opportunity to utilize executive action if needed to do things like pass immigration reform, right? So I think it's important to recognize, again, that we think that the respondents in the survey understand the nuances of immigration policy and the challenges right now of getting anything done. And at the end of the day, they want the president to utilize whatever tools available to him to be able to, again, support immigration reform. As I noted, once upon a time, as an expert of Latino politics, we would really not be talking about abortion access as a key priority for Latino voters. But things have changed significantly, largely as a result of Supreme Court action around abortion and access to reproductive health. So it remains a key issue for Latino voters in 2023, just like it was in 2022. And this year's survey indicates that abortion will be a mobilizing force for Latino voters. You see, we asked folks recently, laws have been passed around the nation to limit the ban on abortion. Does this make you more or less likely to vote in 2024? And you see, at the end of the day, overall, 36% of Latino registered voters across the state of Colorado indicates it makes them more likely to vote, with a slight but important advantage trending towards Democrats, who are more enthused and energized about abortion policy than we see Latino Republicans. But at the end of the day, just like we saw in 2022, we know this is going to have substantial impact on Latino voter turnout, and it's a mobilizing issue for them. Not only is it an important issue that's energizing the Latino electorate across the state, but when we ask folks, how likely are you to support the following potential future ballot measure, making abortion rights stronger in Colorado by allowing state-funded insurance programs to cover abortion costs? You see overall 42% total likely, much higher than the unlikely, with some semblance of the community still being unsure about this and haven't formulated their opinion. But there's high support for allowing state-funded insurance programs to cover abortion costs. And at the end of the day, you see there are partisan differences, as you might expect, with Democrats being more likely to support this initiative if it came up, but you still see strong semblance of both independents and Republicans behind this issue. So it's, again, one we can say that essentially the Latino electorate overall is supportive of allowing state-funded insurance programs to cover abortion costs. The survey also has a large number of items specific to environmental protections. We know climate change is an important salient topic to Latino voters, and we know that there's a range of different public policy issues in this survey that are supported by Latinos. For sake of time, we're emphasizing the fact that Latinos understand that vulnerable communities who have been directly affected by pollution should get additional environmental protections to make sure their communities are no longer exposed to the negative impacts of pollution. We know, if you're an environmental scientist, that unfortunately Latinos across the state of Colorado are more likely to be these vulnerable communities who have been directly impacted by pollution. So it's not surprising that you see overwhelming agreement with making sure those folks are protected by the negative impacts of pollution. Again, whether we're talking about the Denver metro area, Northeast, Southeast, or West, right? It's a key priority for all Latinos across the state. And it is, again, an issue that's not partisan. Slightly higher support among Democrats, but even the majority of Latino Republicans support ensuring that vulnerable communities are protected from the wide range of health implications associated with pollution. The survey also taps into the underlying attitudes of Latino registered voters across the state as it pertains to both the federal and local government. You see there's much more perceived effectiveness at the state level among Latinos in the state than the federal branches of government. Particularly if you look at 44% of Latinos in the state of Colorado do not believe the U.S. Supreme Court has been effective, right? We give some attention to the Supreme Court because we know in 2022, actions by the Supreme Court were an energizing factor and mobilized a large segment of the Latino population in Colorado to vote. We're seeing the same underlying trends in the data in this year's survey in 2023. So we think that might be a powerful mobilizing force for Latinos, just like it was in 2022. At the state level, again, you see higher overall favorability. So it's an important indicator that Latinos in the state of Colorado are sophisticated. They can make distinctions between the performance of the federal government and at the state level. You see particularly the governor of Colorado gets high marks by Latino voters in the state. But whether we're talking about the Colorado Assembly, State House, or Senate, city, town councilors or county commissions, again, Latinos are more supportive of the activities of their local elected officials than we're seeing at the federal branch level. One of the unfortunate realities that we're facing as we look to the 2024 presidential election is a high level of concern about the potential for political violence. And you see one sobering statistic is that there's high concern about political violence in the future among the Latino electorate in the state of Colorado. Whether it's the 81% of folks who indicate they're concerned that a mass shooting could target the Latino or immigrant community, 78% that politicians using language that divides people and encourages discrimination and violence specifically towards immigrants, 67% that politicians and candidates may refuse to accept the election results even when they lose the election. Across the board, unfortunately, Latinos are highly concerned that they might be targets of any of this potential violence. So it's a bit of a wake-up call that we have to ensure the safety of our population as they look towards the ballot box to just be able to cast their ballot. So hopefully this gives us plenty of time to put actions in place to protect our community and make them feel safer just living in their own community and exercising the right to vote. And then finally, again, emphasizing the value and again, the unique opportunity to have multi-year surveys the way this set of collaborators has made happen in the state of Colorado, as we can look at trends over time. And one of the things that we're very interested in is whether or not the underlying values politically align with either one of the dominant parties. And you see that about half of Latino voters said the Democratic Party was most closely aligned to their values, concerns, and priorities, right? So it's trending more positively towards Democrats. But we will say overall in the survey, when we asked a range of questions about underlying relationships with the party and contact, both parties can do a better job of making sure Latinos are contacted and mobilized as we look towards the 2024 election. We also asked folks to think back over the past 3 years since the 2020 presidential election. Do you feel that your political ideology has changed at all? This is an important metric because there's a lot of conversations nationally driven by the state of Texas, the state of Florida, that Latinos are perceived to be moving heavily to the right. Well, not so much in Colorado. you see that overall 43% of respondents indicate that their underlying ideology has not changed at all. And for those that have changed, there's actually a slight advantage towards liberal movement. 34% of Latinos across the state have indicated that since 2020, they've actually trended towards more liberal underlying ideology relative to the 24% that have indicated they're more conservative. So although there's a lot of talk again nationally about movement towards the right among Latinos, that's not part of the reality here in the state of Colorado. So I know I covered a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time. Again, this is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of all the different data that's available to you from the 2023 survey.
And I think now we'd like to hear from Alex Sanchez for his takeaways from this year's research.
Actually, Dusty, do you want to go?
Yeah, I'll go next. Thank you, Gabe, Dr. Sanchez. As you've just heard, the 2023 Colorado Latino Policy Agenda has identified a number of pressing issues facing the Latino community in Colorado. In addition to concerns around the economy, immigration, and gun violence, our polling identified the need for continued access to affordable health care and reproductive health services in the state. The 2023 agenda reinforces what we already know, that our community values the freedom to make their own decisions and is even more motivated to protect and expand abortion access in Colorado through the ballot box, especially as access diminishes in other states. Considering the economic inequalities for Latinos in Colorado, there is a strong case, as you saw on the slide, for expanding state-funded insurance programs to cover abortion care. Being able to lead safe, healthy, and self-determined lives is imperative for our community across Colorado. Now I'll turn it over to Alex for his takeaways.
Thank you, Dusty. And I want to also start by thanking the 1,600 Latinas and Latinos throughout the state who participated in this poll. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and your opinions on the various issues that matter most to our community. Thank you also to all the members of the media who logged in this morning to join us to learn more about these findings. You know, after 3 years of research, it is clear that the challenges facing Latinos in Colorado when it comes to jobs, housing, and the economy are severe and in need of significant action from officials at all levels, local, state, and the federal levels. Latino voters in Colorado continue to rank protections of immigrant rights as a top policy priority for federal officials. This year, for the first time, we gauge opinions on federal immigration policies, a baseline that shows high support for common sense reforms that better support long-term undocumented immigrant contributors who have lived in the shadows without a path forward for far too long. With fresh data revealing new priorities for Latinos, this year's report also allows us to expand on our research base from 2021 and 2022 as we work with elected officials and community leaders to recommend and explore solutions for the future. We hope they will take it to heart and consider the diverse needs, priorities, and growing voice of the Latino community statewide. Another key takeaway, as Dr. Sanchez noted, is that Latinas and Latinos in Colorado are highly interested in being more involved in the political process, but we're also incredibly concerned about the prospects of political unrest and violence. These findings should not go unnoticed. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn over to Curtis to open it up for questions.
Thank you. We do have time for a few questions. We can do them via the Q&A feature in the Zoom, or you can also raise your hand and we can turn on your audio and you can ask the question live. So please, if you've got questions, choose either one of those routes and I will do my best to field them. Our first question is from Hannah Metzger, and she asks whether there are any differences between this year's poll results versus results from previous years that stand out to you. And why don't you take that one, Dr. Sanchez?
You know, a couple things just to note in terms of some of the similarities from last year's poll to this one. And one of them that unfortunately sometimes it feels like we're beating the same drum every election cycle of not enough direct mobilization and contact of Latino voters for a population that's the second largest, second fastest growing across the full state. In this survey, we found that half of Latinos who are registered voters, highly likely voters, and should be on everybody's contact list right? Those are the folks that should be getting contacted. The fact that half of them have not had any outreach activity, I think, is one indicative finding that, again, we're saying the same thing almost every survey, but it's an important finding to point out. One thing too, in terms of methodology, every year we focus on a different public policy area. And part of the thing that we try to do is look at discrimination experiences, unfortunately, facing the Latino community. Last year, we looked specifically at the criminal justice system and police. This year, we looked at healthcare. And unfortunately, a larger segment of our population across the state indicates that they face direct experience just trying to go to a doctor's visit, trying to see a specialist. Those type of experiences, unfortunately, we found in the survey, 10% of all respondents indicated that causes them not to look for healthcare that they know they need because they face discrimination and weren't able to get the care that they wanted to receive the last time they attempted to do so. So that's one of the new interesting insights. If you look at the full range of data, you'll see there's actually a pretty deep dive into healthcare this year.
And just a reminder that this year's report and previous year's reports and polling research is available online at coloradolatinopolicyagenda.org. We do have time for additional questions, so feel free to type those into the Q&A or to raise your hand, and we will answer any questions that you have for us. Our next question comes from Benta Berkland. She says, what was the biggest difference that we saw between rural and urban areas in this year's survey?
Well, I think I'll start with a couple, and then if Alex or Dusty want to lead in, I know they also have a lot of insights, especially in terms of thinking about the rural segments of the state. But one of the things that jumps out is, although the overarching issue priorities, right, when we say federal or state, what's the most important issue to you? Across the state, economic concerns are the highest. But when we think about specifically housing costs, as you might imagine, Denver metro area folks are feeling that a little bit tighter than in other areas of the state. But I think for the most part, we actually see a lot of similarities. Unfortunately, whether you're living in an urban area, you're living in a rural area, the economic squeeze on the Latino population in particular is a high priority, regardless of where people live in congressional districts, rural, urban, or across most of the demographics in the survey as well.
And what I will add also is that, I think as it relates to sort of top issues to address at the state level, if you look at the West region, for example, that's CD3 and a couple other congressional districts, education became a top 3 issue, which also this year's report does capture the sentiment of Latinas and Latinos statewide around key education issues. Are we concerned as a community because we're seeing a trend of radical board members being elected trying to erase race and science and controversies around sex ed education? This is the first time where we went deeper into education policy at the local level to really gauge for the very first time the sentiment of Latinas and Latinos across the state, and we got obviously that data published. But I think for me, one of those issues that was popping up on the rural side was education as a key issue, and we're seeing a high concentration of debates being had where in the past it was always Denver and Aurora and some of the bigger school systems. Now some of those debates are being had at the rural level, and I think Latinas and Latinos obviously are sharing those perspectives in this poll.
And just one other point to add, when we think about issue priorities in the Western slope, lowering healthcare costs is a higher priority than it is for any other region. And part of that is, as you might imagine, as folks have fewer providers in rural areas of the state, not only is their access impacted, but the cost when you're able to see a provider is significantly higher. So I think it just speaks to the nuances, right? That unfortunately Latinos who live in rural areas, although it might be challenges for everybody, it might be heightened for them given the circumstances, particularly in the context of healthcare.
Our next question comes from Robert Tan, and this is for you, Dusty, and/or Alex. Robert notes that housing was a big focus in the legislature this year, yet many policies from land use reform to rent control never made it to the governor's desk. What housing policy or policies do you believe should be addressed in the upcoming session to address the needs of Colorado Latinos and Latinas? Dusty, why don't we start with you?
I'll let Alex start on that one.
You know, we asked a very direct question to in this year's sample, which is, you know, politicians or elected officials talk about creating more affordable housing, but you know, have Latinas and Latinos seen real change in access in their communities? And overwhelmingly, 78% of Latinas and Latinos across the state have not seen the benefits of all of the wonderful policies and ideas and ballot initiatives that have been passed over the last 3 or 4 years, which I think speaks to sort of why within the Latino community, we still very much are in crisis in housing, and we need solutions that are not just going to be good for, you know, for urban setting, but also for rural settings, also for working families. When we speak about housing policies, what I see in the data is that many of those programs may be for teachers and police officers, and that's great. But in rural Colorado, that's where we're least represented in terms of those jobs and professions. And so we got to figure out policies, and I think the data supports the type of growth, the type of density, the type of, you know, new housing availability and affordability that Latinas and Latinos are calling for. Because until we get to housing for the landscaper, the construction worker, the front and back of the house at a restaurant or a hotel, we're still not getting to the working families who are desperately in need of housing, especially in the high country, in the areas where Voces Unidas operates, because the high cost of housing there is just disproportionate to the rest of the state.
And I'll just add that I think, which is another reason why this work that we're doing here with our policy agenda is so critical, because oftentimes decision makers don't take into account all of these different nuances, right? Depending on where someone lives, so rural areas, how it impacts, and so different families. So it's important for us to ask our community how they're feeling, so that we don't guess, or decision makers don't guess. And so I think there's a lot of data that we can and will glean from this, not just around housing policy, but how we continue to engage our community in these conversations throughout the entire year, not just through the legislative session or when Congress is in session, but also during election season. So thank you all for the questions.
And I'll just give you 2 data points on that really important issue. 66% of Latinos in this sample, right, statewide representative sample, indicates that their rent has gone up in the past year. So they're just not feeling these tools that have been put in place through policymakers. It's not reaching the Latino community yet. And a positive note, and it sheds some light on really elected officials leaning in on this issue. The full sample indicates 76% of Latino voters in the state of Colorado indicate that they would support a candidate who makes lower rent and more affordable housing their main dominant policy priority to address in office. So I think the data speaks very loudly to the fact it's still a housing crisis, and Latino voters will reward elected officials who act on that.
And a good summary of the issue is available on pages 8 and 9 of this year's Colorado Latino Policy Agenda, which is available on the website. We do have time for more questions. If you have them, please raise your hand or enter them into the Q&A. All right. Well, with that, we will give a final thank you to everyone who joined us today. A thank you from me to our panelists for their work on this project, now 3 years long. It really is an annual highlight for me as somebody who works in this field to see this research and these policies. As a reminder, this presentation has been recorded and we will be making it available. If you would like us, you can shoot me an email and we will get that to you as soon as it is available. The report is available once again at Colorado Latino Policy Agenda.org. And if you have any needs for additional information, you can find it there. With that, I'll give our panelists one last shot to say farewell or to give any parting wisdom. And otherwise, we will let you get on with your days.
Just thank you for your time, and we're always available to follow up. Obviously, there's a lot of data, and we can't capture it in 20 minutes, but we hope that this is useful throughout the year as we engage in community discussions across the state.
All righty. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.